Teach us and lead us tonight. And bless all those people who didn't make it. In your name, amen. Pray to give them a blessing. So we actually got as far as chapter 9, but let's just back up in chapter 8 and jump in at verse 20, because it's very interesting there. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord. So they landed on Ararat. It's time to leave the boat. They all get out. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, "Never again will I curse the ground because of man, even though every inclination of his heart is evil from childhood, and never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done." So, sounds to me like Jehovah's right there. Like he's not sending in a message. It sounds to me he's there to smell the smell. And if you read in further on, and when Moses talks about the sacrificial system, it usually included offerings that were made, gift offerings, that were not totally burnt up, but were offered to God, but for the whole family to come and have a barbecue. And I think God showed up for this. And often it was a meal. It was supposed to be with God. That's what it was about. But I think he actually probably showed up for this. Although, I mean, you can't prove that. But the fact that he smelled it, some would say, oh, well, that's just hyperbole or something, that he's just trying to make us feel like he was there. But I think it'd be a good case that he was there. The other thing that's very interesting about that text is that this is the first definition of the sinful nature of man since Adam and Eve. He says, even though every inclination of man's heart is evil from childhood. So that's the first real reference to the sinful nature. And Paul does a great job of describing it in the book of Romans, if you go through Romans. And it's his great battle that he's going on, where he has in his heart and his mind, he wants to serve God, but there's this other thing going on in him that makes it so easy for him to do the wrong. And it's a battle that we all have. It will always be there. If you're a good Methodist, as this church has become, Methodism believed that you could reach spiritual perfection in this life. And that those good, holy people, there were a few of them around, actually met perfection. And that is, they didn't think they ever sinned. They thought, hey man, I got all the big ones beat. Anything else is just really small. It doesn't make a big deal. And I'm walking always with God, for God, and in God. And I basically don't sin. And that really leads to Phariseeism, because that's what that is. It's self-righteousness. I can remember even thinking of that at one time when I was in my 20s. Well, I got everything big beat, so it must mean everything is dealt with, no more problems. But the sinful nature is always there, and that's what happened with Adam and Eve. That left the door open for Satan to sneak in and deceive them. As soon as I think I've got it all together, that's the time that Satan is going to try and sneak in there and trick me into doing, saying, or acting in some way that is contrary to God's way. And so the other important thing about that is that it's mentioned so early, and people who do not take that into consideration, it warps their whole thinking about man, because nowadays most people think basically we're good. We may do the odd bad thing, but most of us are good people. And that's coming at it from an altogether different perspective than what God is saying here. He's saying basically you have a problem. Your bent is to wander, to do what is wrong. Now, Calvinists would say you are so bad, you are so depraved that there's no good in you. It's called hyper-Calvinism. And that's wrong too, because even unbelieving people do a lot of good things, and there are a lot of good people out there. They're not holy people, but they're good people. So they're not totally depraved. So people need to interpret that correctly and not go one way or the other with it. But you have to have that as your basis if you're going to proceed to try and deal with what is the condition of man. If you don't assume what God is saying here or treat it as revelation, then it's easy for you to think up all kinds of theories. The other thing about 22 is, as long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest. So as long as the earth endures, if you go to the book of Revelation, the earth is going to endure forever. It's going to be renovated. The surface is going to be changed. But the earth itself is going to endure forever. So that means, if that's true, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, will never cease. Now, it doesn't say that in a way that you could say that it absolutely is going to happen eternally, but I don't see why not, because the earth is going to be here forever. It's going to be changed, and then some people will say, well, it's never going to. The sun it's always going to be daylight in the new heavens and the new earth. But that's only talking about Jerusalem. Doesn't mean the whole world. It's talking about the lights never going out in the New Jerusalem. But that doesn't mean the rest of the world will not have the seasons and night and day. Anyways, nothing to go to a stake for, but it's a thought. By the way, this is the 10th prophecy that we've met in Genesis. So we've had at least one prophecy for every chapter of the book of Genesis, which is the basis upon which God builds his reputation. He predicts, he fulfills, he's believable. And for that reason, people should be believing him, because he's been true to his word. So going back to the sinful nature thing, the point is that people will always be sinners, redeemed, yes, but sinners. The other side of the coin is that God will always provide salvation for those who want it, for those who by faith are willing to accept it and believe for it. So we get to chapter 9, verse 1. Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth." So God blessed for a good reason, because these people were people of faith and people of obedience. And as you work through the Old Testament, you find that God actually does curse people who don't have faith and don't obey. By curse, it means he cannot give you what he would like to give you for you to have the good life. That's the curse. It's not like he's out there to go against you. It's just saying, because of your choices, you are not buying into the benefits of what you get if you follow my laws. And that's the blessing. And these people were people of faith, and so that God wanted to bless them. Verse 2, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. Okay, so what is fill? When is it full? Did God set a time period of when the earth is going to be full? I think there has to be a shelf life for when we can fill this place up. Like the earth has certain limits. You cannot go for another 1,000,000 years, 10,000 years, or whatever, and just keep on producing. So I think he designed the whole thing to go for a certain length of time. And by the way we've lived will determine the length of that or the shortness of it, depending on how we've treated it and how we have responded to it. And then in verse 2, the fear and dread of you will fall upon all the beasts of the earth and all the birds of the air, upon every creature. Every creature that moves along the ground and all the fish of the sea, and they are given into your hands. So that's a very important supernatural ruling by God, because just imagine if you and I had been born in the age of the dinosaurs. We wouldn't be here. The dinosaurs would have overtaken us, and I don't think we could have ever withstood living in that environment. We needed to live in an environment in which God supernaturally would command animals to respect us and to fear us. Now that has two-way street. One is, so it should be relatively easy if we can figure out a way to manage animals, kill animals, eat animals, whatever. The other is we have a responsibility to protect them and to look after them. So depending on what culture you've been raised in, like this is a totally different culture. When I grew up on the farm, if the pig got sick and we decided it was not going to live, you just grabbed a hammer and you hit it over the head and you killed it and threw it in the ditch or wherever. Well, that doesn't go over very well today. You need to be careful. I mean, I think you could probably even be charged if you tried doing that. And so I know that when I grew up, people had an altogether different idea about animals than they have today. And for instance, when we lived in Indonesia, they had a totally different idea about animals. I remember one day my wife marching down the street to challenge the neighbor because he had his dog by the tail and was swinging it around his head. And she went down there and politely, not politely, she very wrathfully told him off. He didn't swing his dog anymore. But they were very cruel animals, and we need to respect them. So, it became a really doctrinal issue. If you were raised in the Catholic Church, you weren't supposed to practice using contraceptives. What does that do? Is that responsible or is that irresponsible? And I think many Catholic people could see that it wasn't reasonable, and they went ahead and did what they thought was the right thing to do. And I don't think the Catholic Church has changed its doctrine on it, but I don't think many Catholic people practice that. I do meet once in a while people who come from a family with 10 kids. I think I met a guy one time who had 20 brothers and sisters. You don't see that happening anymore. And for good reason. I mean, I don't know how you'd buy 20 pairs of running shoes nowadays for your kids if you had 10 or 20 of them. So verse 3, everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. So now their diet changes. Up till now, it seems like they've been vegetarians. Now God is approving the killing of animals for meat. So it goes back that far. So, and maybe I don't know, when Abel killed his sacrifices, I don't know whether they ate part of that or if that was a total sacrifice to God. It doesn't tell us. But then it goes on to say in verse 4, but you must not eat meat that has its lifeblood still in it. So God is beginning to try and help mankind to comprehend the concept, which is a rather difficult one, is that spiritual life comes through the shedding of innocent blood. And that would be a hard one to grasp. How can innocent blood cleanse me of my sin? But that's where he's going to go with it. That's what Jesus was going to eventually do. And the reason being is that, as he says here, the life is in the blood. So therefore God is saying, I want you to respect the blood of an animal by shedding it and not eating it in the meat. And even as far, like you get to Acts, where God shows to Peter that it's okay to eat every animal. Still, after that event in Acts 15, they have the church council, and the 3 things or 4 things that the new Christians ask is, A, don't commit adultery, because now the gospel is going to the Gentiles. So he says, if you're going to take it out there, we would ask you to tell your believers not to commit adultery, not to worship idols, not to eat meat that's been dedicated to idols, and not to eat blood. So even that far on. Now, Paul kind of contradicts the one about eating meat dedicated to idols. He says, if your friend invites you in for dinner, don't ask whether the meat's been dedicated to an idol. If he puts it in front of you, eat it. If he makes a deal that this has been sacrificed to an idol, then you might want to say, really, it's something I don't approve of, idol worship, and so I would rather not eat the meat. But he says if they don't say anything, there's really nothing in it that's going to hurt you. But it's you don't want to offend them, or you don't want to go along with their false beliefs. So if they don't say anything, just go ahead and eat the meat. So in that case, it's iffy, depending on, so you have to decide. Every circumstance is different. You have to decide how this thing is presented to you as to what you're going to do with it. So my father, being raised from a German background, one of their great delicacies is what is called blood sausage. And I can remember eating blood sausage. Now, it didn't taste like blood. It was a form of a sausage that was blood, but it was processed, it was cooked. It was like gelatin kind of thing, but they loved it. And I don't think you could say to a German Christian, it's against God's laws for you to eat that blood. But I think the point is, to get the concept that life is in the blood and that salvation is going to come through the shedding of innocent blood. And blood means life or death. And a life and death situation has to come about of a perfect person and perfect blood for us to be cleansed of our sin. So I think that's why it's mentioned, although Jews would definitely not eat it. We don't, nowadays, they always slit the throat of an animal. They never kill an animal and serve it with the blood in it. Nobody does that. I think it's a health risk. There's disease that you can get easily, or infections or something you can get from meat with blood in it. So, I think there's just good health reasons not to do it. But there are those tribes in Africa where they actually drink blood. And they consider it the masa, I think they're called. And they just feel that makes them manly or something, and they drink real blood. They don't kill the animal, they slit a small slit and catch the milk, get a half a cup and drink it. And it hasn't hurt them physically. But you must not eat meat that has its lifeblood still in it. And for your lifeblood, I will surely demand an accounting. So here he's linking blood with life. And if anybody sheds your blood or kills you, you don't have to shed your blood, just kill you. He's demanding an accounting. I will demand an accounting. Interesting, also from animals. He's going to demand an accounting from animals if they kill people. How? I don't know. This is the second time that an animal has been held accountable for something. The serpent was held accountable for letting Satan use it. What part the animal had in it, I have no idea. But in some way here also, if an animal kills a person, in some way God is holding them accountable. How that would work, I don't know. And from each human, so here's capital punishment, and from each human, being two, I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made man. So there's a good case for capital punishment all the way back that far. So the killing of a person is, or murder is probably the greatest sin. It's a crime against God because he created man. It's a disrespect of God's image because we're made in God's image. It's a crime against society because society loses something every time somebody is killed. It's a crime against the family unit because now the family is missing that person. And it's a crime against that individual because they have lost all earthly future. So, and even Cain says, the punishment for what I've done is 7 times more than for any other crime. So he recognized the very seriousness of this crime. And in some way it holds true today. And I think because there's been some mistakes in crime cases or murder cases, they've taken all murder off the books. But in those cases where it's absolutely obvious or proven or witnesses are there, I don't see why the death penalty should be abrogated. But that's our society. Verse 7. As for you, be fruitful and increase in number, multiply on the earth and increase upon it. So again, it brings up that question, how much is increase? How much can our earth increase? All that we can say is that if our world had been run by God's standards and God values, we could have filled the earth, we could have fed the earth, we could have looked after the earth to the full extent to whatever that time period is. I think there's a time period that God set for this thing to go, and everything could have happened in that time period. But because we haven't lived by his standards, people are going hungry, people are sick and dying from the lack of food. Verse 8, then God sent to Noah and to his sons with him. So here again we have a phrase, then God said. I'm going to say God was there in some way. Now God says in a lot of ways. And I think in Genesis up to this point, God has been communicating in many different ways. He came and walked with Adam and Eve. I think he actually met them on the eastern end of the garden after Abel came back with his sacrifice and Cain came with his. I think God was still showing up in body, but in order for him to show up to everybody at the same time, he switched to meeting us in his spirit because he wants to communicate with all of us at the same time if necessary. When you get to a certain number, he can't do that physically. And so looking back from what we now know as we go from the New Testament to the Old Testament, looking back at the ways God communicated, there are many ways that God has been communicating. So he showed up in a body. He gave the gifts of the Spirit, which are what we have in 1 Corinthians 12, words of knowledge, words of wisdom. These are things that you get from God that you know are not from you. You realize this came not from me, this came from God. I prayed about it. He dropped this picture or this feeling, this intuition into my heart, and I just know that's God. You have that way, you have visions, you have dreams. He then sends angels. So I think the point is that he's trying to get mankind to learn how to communicate with God in many different ways. And I have to work at it. I have to have faith for it. I have to believe for it. But I also have to work at it. And I remember reading the big book in AA, and what was his name? Wilson? What was his first name? Bill Wilson? I think it was Bill. He he believed that he He got the 12 steps, but a lot of 4 or 5 of them came bang, bang, bang within an hour or two of each other. And he said that he had decided that he was going to meditate and try to hear from God because he was going to sit down and write the big book. And these thoughts, which turned out to be the steps, came to him within a matter of minutes or hours. And he sat down and wrote most of them out. And he believed that they were from God, that God gave him those 12 steps, and they've proven to be true. They've been proven to be from God. And so I think God has been doing that down through history, and unfortunately the church has moved further and further away from believing that that is a possibility. And we've intellectualized revelation and thought the most important way of finding out about God is intellectually reading and studying God's Word. That is one way, and that's the place to begin for sure, but it's not the only way. And I need to develop the ability to be hearing from God, because I'm not going to get an answer for everything in life in here. God's not going to tell me what kind of a car to buy, what kind of a house to buy, what girl to marry. All of those decisions, I need to be hearing from God. And I'm not going to get those specific answers just from His Word. And so I need to learn to be hearing from God. And it's just a practice that I have to get into and keep practicing it. And the more I practice it, the better I get at it. Then in verse 8, then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, I now establish my covenant with you. So, here's a group meeting. Guys, I want to have this talk with you. It's not like God just talking with Noah. He's here talking to Noah and to his sons. I think he's on site right there having the chat. And he establishes this covenant. I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you, the birds, the livestock, and all the wild animals, all those that came out of the ark with you, every living creature on earth. So usually in a covenant, it's a two-way street. It's usually made by the greater to the lesser, and the greater is saying, I've defeated you, you're now my vassal, you're under me, but I'm going to make this covenant relationship with you. I'm going to promise to protect you in case any of those other people try to attack you. But there are conditions that you have to live for this thing to work. Part of it is 5 tons of gold a year, or whatever it is. He sets up conditions for this thing to work. So long as you meet the conditions, everything goes well. He keeps his word if he's reliable. He protects you. He does what he promised to do for you. So God takes that concept and he puts it into practice with his people. And he's the greater. And the most visible one is the one that's made at Sinai. And most of them have conditions with them. So Israel had conditions. If you want the blessings, if you want the good things, here are the conditions for it. God was different than the one that is modeled by, because he's not demanding gold from us or stuff from us to satisfy him. He actually gives us stuff. And he gives it in advance of us fulfilling the conditions. So he uses the framework of the covenant as it was used, but he totally reverses it the way it's used. Because the way he does it, he says, if you commit to the covenant, I'll give you the blessings up front. Now, the blessings will fail if, after time, it's proven that you're not living up to the conditions. I will remove them, but I'm going to give them to you in advance. And that's why he got so angry with Israel, and why he was justified in judging them, is because he gave them all the blessings up front. They promised that they'd keep everything and do everything. They got all the goods, and then they say, goodbye, God. Thank you very much. We've got what we want, and we're not going to follow you now. And the reason they wanted to do that is because the nations around them had their gods with much lower standards. It's okay to go to the temple and have sex with the prostitutes in the temple. It's okay to do this and to do that. So, let's do that. Let's adopt those idols and that way of living. And so they took all the good stuff that God gave them, then they chose these other idols. And that's why God justifiably could bring judgment upon them. In this case, there are no stated conditions. There are unwritten conditions, but they're not stated conditions. Now, I establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you. So he's establishing with all these things. I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. So, man can get as sinful as he wants. God is never going to destroy it again by a flood. But there are unwritten conditions, and God said, this is a sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature with you. A covenant for all generations to come. All generations, everybody, not just these people, everybody. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. So the unwritten condition was, every time anybody in the world looks at a rainbow, it should remind them of why it got there, and that God put it there, and that what happened back in Noah's time was because people rebelled and sinned and disobeyed God, and he brought judgment. And that is still the same. That never changes. So people can ignore why a rainbow is in the sky and never think of where it came from. But there's an unwritten condition. The unwritten condition is you should be respecting who put it there, you should be respecting why it's there, and you should be respecting the rules and the regulations and the laws that lead me to bless you and not bring judgment of another kind, maybe, at some other time upon you. And so that was the unwritten condition that all people are supposed to have. And of course, most people look at the rainbow now and they make no connection between that and God or Noah and the flood. But God says you're responsible. I put it there, and it's up to you to remember why it's there, and to respect me, and to have faith in me, and to trust me, because there are consequences if you don't follow my ways. And with every living creature that was with you, the birds, the livestock, and all the wild animals, all those that came out of the ark with you, every living creature on earth. I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. He still is going to bring judgment on people. He's not going to destroy the earth no matter how bad we get. But if we get bad, we do pay. Instead of destroying the earth, he actually will destroy people. So you get to the book of Revelation, you have these terrible calamities happening, and people are dying by the millions. So God is going to act. He's not going to bring about a flood, but he is going to act, and people are going to pay. And it's not just about paying, it's about God using every method possible to try and reach people. And I've said it before, one of his last items on the list to try and get our attention is called pain. And he will apply the pain, even if it means us dying, hoping that at some point in that pain we will turn to him and accept him. And sometimes it takes a lot of pain to get our attention. Unfortunate, but it's true. And I think that's the way that the book of Revelation is ending. There's going to be a lot of pain because God has hopes there'll be some that will turn to him. It says most will not. No matter what the pain level is, there's some people that will shake their fist as they die. And that's just the way some people are. But he's going to do it because there are some that will. And rather just obliterate us, he could do that too. He's not doing that. He's going to apply the pain, and at every level there might be some at that level that will turn to him. And I think that's the point of it. Now, he is going to renovate the earth. So in this case, he did it by a flood. In the next case, it's going to be by fire, but nobody's going to die in the fire. Everybody who is against God is going to be dead already when he does that. It's going to be only believers that are here when he renovates the earth with fire. And he's taking us out of that, above the fire, till he does the firing. And then he's bringing us back to a renewed new earth. So there's a bit of a contrast there. In this case, a flood versus, let's just say, high voltage. Let's say the flood is one method, but after the flood is over, it's awful stinky, rotten. I don't know, you smell spring in the early spring, it smells really yucky. That's a kind of a different way of cleaning things up, refining things, or not even refining, ending things, compared to, say, electric shock high enough to change everything. And people are out of here by then. So that's more of a refining process, and it has a different concept to it than the messiness of cleaning it all up by way of a flood. The cleanup goes on for a long time after the flood is down. The people in the Ottawa there, they're not going to get at those houses for weeks, and some of them, it's going to be too late. Whereas the concept of the fire is kind of a beginning of zap, and he's just going to make it new. And it's not a new earth, it's just the surface of the earth. The earth is always going to be here. It's just the surface is going to get zapped. And that's what's going to be new. And so I think, for what it's worth, I think we miss the stinkiness of it, the rottenness of cleaning up after a flood. Verse 16, whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth. Another interesting comment, God is going to see it. If you go to the end of Genesis and you see God coming down and visiting Abraham with two angels, and he says, I want to go and I want to see what's happening in Sodom and Gomorrah. He wants to do an on-the-site job check. He wants to see himself what's going on. So I think he did. I think he walked right down into Gomorrah, and he walked through the streets, and he looked at what was happening. And two or three other occasions in the Bible, you have that sense where God actually has come onto the scene, and he's got right down where it is, and he walked through it and seen what it is. And then it says it makes him very angry what he sees, and then he takes action. So here it says he sees the clouds. Now this is a tricky one because you can explain the rainbow in strictly scientific terms. Rain plus sunlight in the right perspective gives you a rainbow. And that has led some scientists into what is called a mechanistic world belief. You believe everything is cause and effect. You don't believe God is involved in anything. And you think all we need is more knowledge to understand whatever is going on around you. Yes, we need to know and discover the laws of the universe to figure things out, but God steps outside of those laws at times, and that's what a miracle is. He steps outside the law, and he does something beyond the law. And people come to a text like this and say, well, see, it's just cause and effect. That's the way, all those things we don't understand, if we just had more knowledge, we'd be able to figure it out. Well, a lot of it you can if you figure out the laws of the universe, but we also have to calculate the possibility that God can step into time, change the laws, write the law off for a second or two or whatever length of time he wants to do it, he change things. And, change the water to grape juice. Happened in Indonesia. 10 years before we ever went there, a guy by the name of Mel Tari a bunch of Bible schools, went to the Eastern Islands, going to have communion. They had no wine. They had been traveling for days through the jungle to get to these villages. They wanted a communion service. They didn't have any wine. A little old lady who was a Christian in the village got a pot of water, put a cloth over it, prayed over it, thought, well, this is all we've got, and poured it, and it was wine. And it happened. And God can do that. And but if you're a totally cause-effect person, no, you do have no room for miracles. And that's what happened at seminaries in the 1800s. Rationalism came into the seminaries, and they tried to do Bible studies strictly by a scientific method. And it took over Bible schools and seminaries. The scripture can say no more than what I can see is written in black and white on the page. And I can't take any other meaning out of that text than what I can see written there. And so they threw out what is called the, what's the word for the other word? The rhema word. A rhema word is the Greek word. There's the logos word and there's the rhema word. The logos is what is printed and written, black and white ink. The rhema word is you look at the black and white ink and God says something to you out of the text. That is not obvious in the text, but God is saying it to you, and you're sure this is God talking to you. So that's called a rhema word. Well, Bible schools and seminaries threw that out. They said, oh, God doesn't talk to us anymore that way. We can only say what the text says based on the black and white print that's on the page. Don't try and make it say anything else. But if you look at quotes by Jesus of Old Testament texts, he comes up with a totally different meaning than what it seemed to be saying in the Old Testament text. And Jesus himself practiced it. So he practiced the rhema word. He believed that God could say something to him from an existing revelation and put a new revelation upon it. So it's a choice we have to make, whether we believe God can do that or not. And comes down to believing in miracles or not. Of course, you have to be careful because then you had people who were running around making the word say whatever they wanted to. And that's why they threw it out in the first place, is because too many people were doing that. Because I can take the word and twist it to make it mean something that I want it to make. That's not right either. So, but I need to be going to God's word and be looking for it to say something to me, which is not completely obvious in the text.
Is there any reason why God talks about himself in the third person there in verse 16?
How does he put it? Verse 16.
Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind. Because that's God speaking.
Okay, I don't know. You'd have to look at the Hebrew. He might be using the word Elohim there for God. And the Hebrew word for Elohim is the plural.
Right.
So he may be saying us guys, we, when we see it. I don't know. You have to see there. It's interesting in Isaiah's calling, commission, God says in this vision to Isaiah, he says, how does it go? I will send somebody, I want to send somebody, and who will go for us? So he's sending somebody, but he's looking for somebody to go for us guys. It's in the plural. It switches from the singular to the plural. Sometimes they put it in the text so you can see it, and sometimes you'd have to look at the Hebrew and see. I don't know whether they use the Elohim version there for the plural form or not there, but so God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant. Another interesting fact there is God's looking for rainbows. Rainbows are signs. God looks for signs. If God looks for signs, I should be looking for signs. So that encourages me to be looking for things in which I can see God show up. I will see them different than you. Some things we will see together and recognize it as a sign. But I have to begin that process in my own personal life to be looking for where God is showing up. And it affirms my faith, and mainly signs are for believers. So all the signs that God or Moses did in Egypt, they didn't see them as signs. They saw them as tragedies. They were Mother Nature doing weird things. There were signs and wonders. The term is used by Moses. These are signs and wonders from God. So for the Israelites, they were signs and wonders. But for the Egyptians, they were just freaks of nature. They had no explanation for them. So a sign and a wonder is for a believing person. Sometimes other people should be able to see the sign, but it doesn't necessarily mean they will see the sign. Look at all the miracles that Jesus did. The religious leader says, that's Satan. Those are demons doing that. They could not see a good sign in what he was doing. I mean, how obvious does it have to get? But they didn't see them as signs. So a sign is a faith thing. I have to be looking for them. I have to see them. People will just say, oh, it's just coincidence. Oh, it's just good luck or whatever. Well, God doesn't operate that way. And yeah, there are things that are unexplainable. But I find that I see enough things in my life that I can point out what I think is God acting in my life. And if I put that into practice, I can see it in a broader context in his kingdom. So God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant I have established between me and the life on earth. Verse 16, 18. The sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. Interesting, that little remark. So what? The others had all kinds of nations behind them. Well, in a little while, a few verses down, we're going to find out that Ham gets cursed for an action that he did. And this is just setting us up as to where his progeny will be heading, where it will be going. It's going to explain itself down in a few verses. These were the three sons of Noah, and from them came the people who were scattered over the whole earth. There was a conference here in the city a couple of years ago where some of the guys checked in with scientists who checked in on the research of evolutionists, and who were trying to make the case that anthropoids, mankind, spontaneously grew up in different parts of the world, different places, and they've been able genetically to prove that they came from one source, not from many different sources. And so it all goes back to Noah. That's the genetic line that we have to go back to. Noah, a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard. If you read the King James Version, it says he was a husbandman. A lot of things get missed by just changing a translation, because if you look at the word husbandman, you find that it becomes a symbolic term used throughout the Bible. God is the husbandman of Israel. And Jesus talks about the husbandman pruning the vine. And he uses those terms and puts a spiritual meaning to them. But if you just say, he was just a man of the soil, you miss that. And so it's good to read 2 or 3 translations when you're reading it, because some translations, for instance, in the NIV, if it's talking about the spirit and soul of a person, it just talks about the life of the person. Well, there's a big difference. If it is actually referring to the spirit and the soul in a situation, there's a big difference than just saying, oh, the life of the person was crushed, compared if you say the spirit of the person was crushed. We now know we put an altogether different interpretation on that text with that understanding. But the NIV just calls it life. The life got crushed. Well, you miss that. So different translations are good to check with. Noah, a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard. When he drank some of its wine, he became drunk. and lay uncovered inside his tent. Why, Noah, are you drinking in excess? Obviously, he had learned how to make wine. People say, well, they had to make wine in Jesus' time because of the poor water supply, and the only safe thing to drink was wine. That's a point, I guess. But obviously, he knows about such a thing as called alcohol. And there's an alcohol content here. And if he was able to make wine enough to get drunk on, he had to have some concept that there is different degrees or different levels of alcohol content. And the more you distill it, the higher the alcohol content. And also, the volume of what you drink is going to have an effect on you. So if you have been processing this stuff, you've been drinking it, you've developed it, you know there's a difference between drinking a glass of this and drinking a jug of it. And I think Noah knew that. But he's human. And I think this was one of his weaknesses. I think he had probably been drinking wine for a long time. I think he knew at what level you get a buzz, or at what level it takes all the worries away. And there's the possibility that Noah thought, you know what, I've got the whole world on my shoulders. Everything's up to me. I got to look after all these people, all these animals. I got to make all the decisions. I need a break. Where's that jug? Glug, glug, glug. I feel good. He can forget his worries. I think that's what happened. I think he knew what he was getting into. I think he just, for whatever reasons, felt he needed a comfort that he was not getting, and where he should have been going to God for the comfort. And he went to the jug to get his comfort. And it did do that. It lifted all that weight for a little while. But he got drunk. And bad things happen when you lose track of reality. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked and told his two brothers outside. So it kind of assumes here that dad's drunk, he's in the tent naked, and Ham sees this, and he tells his brothers, but Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it across their shoulders. Then they walked in backward and covered their father's naked body. Their faces were turned the other way so that they would not see their father naked. So, what does naked mean? Is that a euphemism for some other things? Surely Ham had seen his father bathing in the river. I don't think that's the first time he saw him naked. Maybe it was. I don't know. I mean, the whole thing, the very minimum is it's a great disrespect of parental authority. That's the very least, but it could be a lot worse. It could have mean he saw his mother and father having sex. That was the big bad thing that he leered at. Or did he rape his father? I think any of those are possibilities out there. He did something that was very, very, what his two brothers thought was very wrong. It does make it seem like it's just plain nakedness, because they just take a garment, turn their backs, and go walk in backwards and cover him up. So I don't know. You can go wherever you want with it, but whatever it was, Ham demonstrated a great disrespect. In whatever way he played that out, I don't know. And it really is saying something that was going on in his heart, in his relationship to his parents, or his respect or lack of respect for them. Because when Noah wakes up, he says, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers." So it's a pretty serious charge. Now, a curse is not fatalism. So what the point of the curse is I think the way I would phrase it is, he has done a very disrespectful thing, and anybody of his descendants, or anybody else's descendants really, who practice this kind of an attitude, you too can be cursed. So it doesn't mean that all of Ham's descendants are cursed. It means all of those who buy into his practice, whatever that practice was in the situation. Whatever that practice was, the degree into which anybody else buys into it, to that degree they will also be cursed. And the curse is slavery. Well, that's true of any sin. I practice any sin long enough, I'm the slave. So it's not just this particular kind of a sin that leads to that. Every kind of sin practiced long enough makes me its slave. And every descendant of Ham needed to decide, am I going to practice the same kind of attitude or action, whatever that was, that our great-grandfather practiced? If I practice that, then I can expect slavery of some kind. And I don't think it was just true of his descendants. I think it was true of everybody's descendants. It was a lesson to both of them. And the next verse is very interesting, verse 26. He also said, "Praise be the Lord, the God of Shem." Here he's saying, in sort of terms, Shem has decided who his God is going to be. And God blesses him. And the Shemites turn out to be through whom the Messiah comes, who the Jews come from. And I think here's a man that decided at this point who his God was going to be. I don't think Ham made that same decision. I think they came out of the ark from a horrendous experience, some perhaps bitter and angry and mad at God and the rest of their neighbors and everybody that got them into this mess. And maybe some came out shaking their fist at God, and maybe Ham was one of them. Others came out of it and said, you know what? I can see what sin does. It brings judgment, and God in his kindness has shown us grace and given us salvation. I am going to follow that God. I think that's where Shem went with it. And I think Ham went the other way. But the option is open for all of us, and every individual gets that choice. He also said, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the slave of Shem. May God extend Japheth's territory, and may Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be the slave of Japheth." So the interpretation seems to be that the Hamites are going to wander away from God, and the Japhethites are going to respect the God of Shem, even though they're not going to be as close to God as the Shemites are. There's going to be some of them that are going to greatly respect God. And the Japhethites are the ones who went west, north and west. They went to Europe, and where we get modern civilization, where Christianity, where Judaism was appreciated and followed, and I think they got blessed. And the Hamites went south. And most of Africa went Islamic and other belief systems. And not all Shemites stayed faithful, because some of them went even further east as far as China. So I think it's the first indication of the line in which the Messiah is going to come. And we do know that the Jewish people came through Shem. And I think Shem was making a stand because God knew his heart, and God spoke that about him. So why don't we leave it there? Our time is up.
Shem and Ham.
Shem and Ham. So we'll pick it up at verse 27 next time. Jesus, thank you for your word. We thank you for your truth. We ask for the courage to live it, to believe it, and to see you in our lives. Thank you for meeting with us tonight. Bless us until we meet again. In Jesus' name, amen.